I've been working in the film industry now for about 10 years. What I do specifically isn't what you would call glamorous, but it's still awesome to be part of the industry. In a nutshell, I basically scout locations for films and make sure the location is suitable for specific scenes. A lot of my peers in this industry got their start by falling in love with movies at an early age. For me, it was a very early age. My grandfather was a producer back in the 1960s. He worked with legendary talents such as Audrey Hepburn and Alfred Hitchcock, John Wayne, and even Elvis Presley. When I was really young, he would entertain my brother and me as well as all of our cousins with wild and engaging stories about this myth-like Hollywood world from this time period. When I got a little older, I would notice that my grandma would almost sigh and look uncomfortable when my grandpa talked about his time in the business. When my grandpa died years later when we were adults, me and my brother talked about some of the stories he told us, and we recalled my grandma's weird behavior. We threw around some ideas, but sadly, we arrived at the idea that during that period, my grandpa must have had an affair in Hollywood or something. It just made sense. The way my grandma would basically transform into another person every time Grandpa brought up Hollywood screamed unpleasant memories. And though it's not fair to assume it was an affair or something, we just think back to that time period in Hollywood, and let's be honest, it was like the Wild West of partying. Beautiful actresses everywhere. My grandfather being this hotshot producer, it unfortunately just made sense, as horrible as it is to think about. So why am I writing the story, though? Last month, me and my brother finally asked my grandma what happened while he was in Hollywood. We didn't want to hear fairy tale stories that my grandpa would share anymore. We wanted to know the truth, especially since I started working in the industry myself. Just in case it had been an affair, we approached the subject very delicately with my grandma. We didn't want to upset her or bring up horrible memories. After all, until the day he died, my grandmother always showed so much love and admiration for my grandpa, so it just seemed weird that he would ever do something like that. My brother, being the smooth talker of the two of us, asked her point blank, "Why did Grandpa leave Hollywood, and why do you always go quiet and leave the room every time Grandpa would tell us stories?" My grandma took this long, deep breath, and she responds, "I suppose you're old enough to hear the story now." And as she began telling us this long story, like only old folks can, we could not have been more wrong. And I'm going to do my best to tell the story without leaving anything out. My grandma couldn't remember the exact year, but at some point during his run as a producer, he decided to move my grandma to Hollywood, a detail that I never knew. When she was in her early 20s, she was an aspiring actress, and she was beautiful. Grandpa used his connections to get her some auditions and a chance to meet some of the big players in town. Grandma didn't want anything handed to her, though, so she used a different last name and never used my grandpa's name in an audition. She wanted to get a part based solely on her talent and not because she was married to the producer of the film, and something I greatly appreciated. After several failed auditions, she was almost ready to move on from her dream and try her hand at modeling since she had some offers. She went on one last audition for a supposedly big film opportunity, and she told us that Grandpa was skeptical of this audition because he had never heard of the director or the film. But my grandma was being stubborn and told him to trust her and that she knew what she was doing. On the way to the audition, she got lost and found a rundown building way on the outskirts of town, I guess. She was so new to the area that she didn't question the location at all. She thought that maybe this location was a creative choice by the director and maybe he had an office in the building. She walked in the door and inside were 4 individuals, 3 women and 1 man. All 4 of them were wearing masks, and as soon as my grandma tried to make a run for it, 2 of the women grabbed my grandmother and started to beat her. After a few minutes, they tied her up in a chair. One of the women told her that if she wanted to survive, she was going to have to do something for them. If she refused, things weren't going to end well. So, Grandma agreed, hoping that she could find a way out of the situation somehow. The woman continued to explain to my grandma that she was going to rob an apartment for them. The 4 monsters in the room told her that they would be outside the building, and if she tried to call for help or run, they would know, and they would find her and catch her. The woman explained all the details of the robbery to my grandma, and she played along for a moment, realizing that this may be her only chance to survive. She assumed that once she was inside the apartment that she could find a phone, or even better, the person would be home and she could explain what was happening. They arrived at the apartment building and my grandma's plan went out the window. The man in the group accompanied my grandma to the building and followed her down the hall. He was carrying some type of pipe in his hand, and she had the sick feeling that the pipe was for her. The door was unlocked, and they went inside. They gave my grandma a cloth sack and told her to fill it with cash. They assured her that there would be cash on a table inside the room, and sure enough, they were correct. My grandma started to slowly put the cash into the bag as she tried to think of a way out. The man shoved her and told her to hurry up. While she was filling up the bag, she noticed a vase on the table with some flowers in it. She grabbed the glass vase, smashed it on the man's face, and ran out the apartment while the man fell on the ground. She noticed there was a back entrance to the building and sprinted out that back door. She ran several blocks and then found a cop car parked in the lot, and she frantically approached the police and told them everything. Cops had a little less sense of urgency towards women back then, and it took them a minute to actually believe my grandma and take her statement. They eventually called my grandpa, and he decided to raise hell. Thankfully, my grandmother was able to give a very detailed description of her captors, which led to the arrest of one of the women, but the other 3 people were never caught. She never found out whose apartment it was, but she assumed it belonged to someone in the dark underworld of Hollywood at the time. The woman they arrested admitted the plan was to knock out my grandmother inside the apartment after she filled the bag and basically pinned the entire thing on her. They didn't plan on her escaping or having a powerful husband, though. They assumed that she was some young actress in Hollywood, and getting caught at the scene of the crime would just make her another poor soul getting lost in the dark world of show business. This nightmare scarred my grandma so much that she didn't want to spend another second in that town. She moved back to her parents' house, and my grandpa followed several months later, and that's when they started their family. He would tell us fun and happy stories to entertain us kids, but whenever he mentioned his time in Hollywood, Grandma couldn't help but think about the nightmares she'd endured. I can't imagine what my grandma was thinking during that ordeal, and I'm just so happy that she was able to get out of it and find a little bit of justice. As for the 3 other monsters from that night, I just hope they got caught for something else, and that justice was eventually served. Last month, I visited my grandparents for the first time in a couple of years. I know how horrible that sounds, but my grandparents live on the other side of the country, so it's hard, you know? It was actually a family reunion, and it was amazing just seeing my entire extended family. I saw cousins, aunts, uncles that I hadn't seen in a very long time. My grandparents live on a massive farm. When we were younger, we only lived about 30 minutes away, so once in a while we went over and stayed overnight. In all the years that I stayed there, I always had a fantastic time and felt safe. Well, little did I know just how unsafe I actually was. At the family reunion, when everybody was sitting around and sharing stories, my grandfather told us one of the most unsettling and unnerving things I had ever heard. One night when me and my cousin James were staying overnight at the farm, my grandparents had an unwanted visitor. As my grandpa started telling the story, I remember exactly what night it was because it was the only time in my entire life that my grandpa yelled at me. The night started like most sleepovers. James and I were playing outside, ate some pot pie with extra gravy, and drank root beers pretending that they were actual beers. The farmhouse had this little creepy loft that had a pull-out bed and a small TV that we had the PlayStation hooked up to. We would usually stay up all night playing games like Spyro the Dragon or Crash Bandicoot. It wasn't uncommon for my grandma to knock on the loft door and tell us to keep it down. She would do this often throughout the evening. On this specific night, we thought that we were being smart by turning off all the lights and keeping the volume turned down low. Around midnight, we heard an extremely loud bang downstairs. We paused the game and we just stared at each other. We both had that sickening feeling in our stomachs. I remember thinking to myself that one of my grandparents just fell or something, and I didn't know if I was mentally strong enough at that time to help pick them up. We both stayed quiet for a minute and felt a combination of relief and panic when we heard nothing but silence. We didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, and we started playing the game again, but something didn't feel right. James paused the game again and told me to go check on them, just in case something happened and they needed our help. I opened the loft door, just for the sake of the visual. It was one of those loft doors on the ceiling. When the door opened, a small ladder-like staircase would come down. I slowly descended the stairs, trying to listen intently. I could hear the murmuring of voices, but I couldn't make anything out specifically. As I slowly crept down the hallway, I heard another loud bang that just about made me jump out of my skin. It was like the sound of a door slamming. As I kept walking, I saw my grandpa turn the corner with an intense look in his eye, and he pointed to the loft and yelled, "Now!" at the top of his lungs. I was terrified. I'd never heard my grandpa yell, and I never saw that look on his face, which was infinitely worse than the yelling. I turned around, sprinted up the loft, and shut off the TV. James kept asking what happened, and I just kept telling him to shut up and that Grandpa was mad at us. We heard some more loud banging and shuffling throughout the night, but we both eventually fell asleep. That morning, both my grandparents looked exhausted. They were both drinking coffee in the living room. My grandpa had his hunting rifle out, which we thought was kind of weird, but ultimately we just let it go and forgot about it. My grandparents were really weird that morning, though. But after that morning, they were the same old grandparents the next time we saw them. Well, at the family reunion, my grandfather finally told us what actually happened that night. That loud bang we heard initially that caused James and me to worry was the sound of an intruder trying to break down the front door. At first, my grandpa scared them away. By the time I was in the hallway and heard the second loud noise, that was the sound of the intruder successfully breaking down the door. My grandma was able to hide in the coat closet. When my grandpa turned the corner and saw me in the hallway, he only yelled the word "now" because he didn't want to alert the intruder that someone else was in the house. He just hoped that pointing to the loft would communicate to me that I better get up there. Luckily it was, but it was only because I was scared of getting yelled at. After I went back into the loft and shut the door, my grandpa went and grabbed his hunting rifle. My grandma successfully forced the intruders to leave, but he wasn't going to take any chances, so he stayed awake all night in the living room. He did call the sheriff, who was a good friend of my grandpa, and he told him that there was no reason to send anybody. He explained what happened and basically made an unofficial report over the phone. All of this happened while me and James were upstairs, and we had no idea that our lives might have been in danger. When I was in the hallway, I was only several feet away from that intruder, and I had no idea. When he told us this, I was angry that he didn't tell us before, but honestly, I really don't blame him. They were just trying to keep us young kids safe, and it worked. I never had to experience the nightmare of a home invasion while trying to protect my family. My grandpa is a legend for defending his home, wife, and grandkids. He admitted to us that he never quite slept right ever since that night, and I can totally understand why. It just makes you think. I wonder what else happens when you think you're truly safe. I never realized how many interesting stories my grandpa had. I never had a great relationship with my grandparents, not for any bad reasons, but mainly just because our lives didn't intersect a lot. A few years back, my grandma died, and I noticed how alone and sad my grandfather was. I decided to start spending more time with him. I don't know if it was the guilt of not spending a lot of time with my grandma or if just truly feeling bad for Grandpa, but for whatever the reason, I started going over to his house once a week just for coffee and to chat. I knew my grandpa served in the war, but I never heard any stories growing up. I believed he served in the Korean War, but I don't actually know. All I do know is that he was stationed in Germany for sure and a few other European countries during that time. One afternoon, he and I started talking, and we started talking about his time in the military. He told me that he didn't meet my grandma until he got home from the war, so being a single man in Europe, he was spending a lot of time with women. He told me when he was in Germany, a few of the guys he was stationed with went to one of the local pubs. And forgive me if you're from Germany, I don't know what the proper term is for a bar or a pub in that culture. While he was drinking with his buddies, he met a woman named Irma. And from the way he described Irma, I could tell that he was in love with this woman, or at least very infatuated. He told me she was beautiful. Curly blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that could light up an entire room. Those were his words, obviously, and not mine. He spoke a little German, and she spoke a little English. They hit it off right away, and before he knew it, he was heading back to Irma's place. I didn't think bar encounters like that happened in the 50s, so I was surprised to hear that little detail. He started to tell me details about the walk back to her place as well. He said that he should have seen the warning signs, but he was hypnotized by her beauty, and not to mention that he had been drinking quite a bit, so he wasn't in the perfect state of mind. It didn't take long for them to start walking down dark and secluded alleyways, and before he knew it, they were surrounded by nothing but trees. He could hear the sounds of twigs snapping around him, but he just figured it was maybe animals in the forest. They arrived at a small cottage roughly 100 yards or so into the woods. She invited him, and he said it looked like something from an old fairy tale. It was an all-wooden cottage with a fireplace, 2 small chairs in front of the fireplace. There was a small loft and a ladder that led to a small bed. There was a table and a small kitchen, and that was about it. Irma started a fire and poured my grandpa some beer. He was a romancer, so right away he asked her to come back to America with him when his time was over. It's hard for me to wrap my head around something like that, but it was a different time. She seemed flattered by the offer, but dodged the question several times. Then his tone started to shift as he continued telling me the story. She started to unbutton his military uniform. He turned his head in a moment of pleasure and only caught a quick glimpse, but he was immediately startled by what he saw outside the window. He jumped up out of the chair and started to tell Irma what he saw. He said a man was in the window spying on them, and as soon as he noticed, the man ducked down. Irma seemed dismissive and kept trying to distract my grandpa. As much as he wanted to give in to Irma, he felt a duty to protect her in case it was some kind of threat. He started to remember all the noises he heard on the way to the cottage and started to fear the worst. What if they were followed by someone from the pub, he thought. He finally was able to break away from Irma and demanded that he needed to take a look outside, and she seemed upset but didn't say anything. Grandpa went to the table near the door where he had set his weapon, and it wasn't there anymore. He turned around and asked Irma where the weapon was, and she just stood in front of the fire. At that moment, a large man, speaking German, broke through the door and clocked my grandpa right in the face. He described the pain as if though he were getting struck in the face by iron. The woman started speaking German as well, and because my grandpa wasn't an expert in the language, he couldn't follow what was being said. That and the fact that his head was ringing from the sucker punch that he just received. The man then continued to beat my grandfather up. He told me it was the worst pain that he'd ever been in, and he truly couldn't move. The man threw my grandpa on the table in the cottage, pulled out a hunting knife, and actually stabbed my grandfather in the side. He said Irma began freaking out and they both fled into the woods, leaving the door wide open. And he said the pain was indescribable. It hurt so bad that he almost was numb to it. He laid on the table, trying to apply pressure to the wound, hoping to somehow see the sun again. He ended up passing out and waking up in a military-run medical center. He was lucky to be alive, and he thanked his lucky stars every day that someone found him. When one of his military buddies was leaving the pub that night, he saw Irma and the large man who wasn't my grandpa running down the road. He immediately became suspicious and had a bad feeling in his gut. He decided to walk in the direction that Irma had just come from. He saw muddy footprints that came from the forest and he decided to continue investigating, and before long, he wandered to the cottage, and since the door was still open, he was able to see my unconscious grandfather on the table. He carried him all the way back to base, and thankfully they were able to save my grandpa. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. My grandpa stayed in touch with this man until he passed away 5 years ago. He would constantly tell this man that he was a hero and that he owed him his life. I wish I could thank him as well. My grandpa showed me the scar, and even after all these years, he said that he can still feel it, and every time he sees the scar, he's reminded of the horrible night. He never saw Irma again. They never found her or the large man that she was with. He was more heartbroken about Irma rather than the fact that he was nearly murdered. I can't imagine the fear my father felt that night. I found this story to be fascinating and scary, and I asked him if I could share it, and he agreed. He told me to end it by saying, "Be careful who you give your heart to, because they may just try to cut it out when you least expect it." This is a weird story I just found out for the first time about a year ago from my grandma. She just passed away a few weeks ago, rest her soul, and I thought that I would share this wild story that she told me and see if it entertains you like it entertained me and my husband. For starters, I found out that my grandma was married once before my papa. That blew my mind because I'm 30 years old and I never knew that. I was even more blown away when she told me that papa never knew either. She never wanted to hurt him, and then so much time had passed that she didn't think it was important to even bring it up since she never had any kids with him or anything like that. He was a dangerous man, she said. She was only 19 and she was attracted to the bad boy. She was even more attracted to him because he was interested in her. He made her feel important. He was feared and respected among his peers, and the fact that he liked her just made her go head over heels. She started hitting the road with him. His name was Davy. He would roll his cigarettes in a short-sleeved shirt. His hair was always slicked back, and if he wanted something, he got it. She knew that he would use force sometimes to get what he wanted, but he would always make her wait outside or in another room so she didn't have to witness anything. She was scared most of the time, she admitted, but she was addicted to the fear. And your first love will always have that vice grip on your heart, for better or for worse. They were living in a small boarding house, essentially paying weekly to rent a room. They were on the move a lot, so they needed places like this where they pretty much could leave at a moment's notice. One night, Davy came bursting through the door. He was wild and angry and yelled at my grandma to grab what they needed and that they needed to leave right now. She couldn't be sure, but she thought that she could see what looked like blood on his shirt and jeans. She was upset and tried to get Davy to relax and explain what happened, but he was just being angry and yelling. She learned over time that when Davy was like this, it was better to just do what he said. They hit the road, and he didn't say anything for hours. Finally, my grandma asked what happened, and all Davy said to her was that they were never going to speak about tonight and that he wanted my grandma to forget about it. After all the horrible things she knew that he did, for some reason, this felt worse to her. She knew that he was bad news, but that's what she liked about him. But whatever happened that night she knew was over the line, and she never forgot that feeling. Eventually, they moved on and had a small wedding ceremony. She wanted kids, and Davy would just tell her that someday they will. Well, that day never came, and my grandma started to get impatient, and not to mention, the bad boy routine was starting to finally affect my grandma. She was always worried that she'd see him come home covered in blood, or worse, not come home at all. One night, her worst dreams nearly became a reality. They were home having an evening together, and there was a knock on the door. It was an older gentleman that she didn't recognize. Davy yelled at her to stay in the bedroom, so she listened with her ear at the door. She couldn't make out all the words, but the conversation seemed hostile. A few minutes later, Davy came into the room and said that he needed to leave and that he would be back later. She tried to pry out from him where he was going, but he wouldn't say anything. He seemed different this time. Instead of anger, he appeared to be more scared than anything. She waited all night, and Davy never came home. She didn't call the police because he always told her no matter what, don't call the cops. She decided to take action into her own hands and play detective. She looked around their small apartment for any clues. She found some notes with a street address on them, and that morning she walked to that address. She didn't find Davy and instead found something that haunted her for decades. It was a warehouse, and inside, she found a very gruesome scene. I don't want to go into details my grandma went into, but let's just say that there was a lot of blood and a body. She ran to a nearby store and had the clerks call the cops. My grandma claimed to the cops that she had just stumbled upon the site by accident. She never knew to throw Davy under the bus. He always made that abundantly clear to her. They never identified the body, and as far as she knows, he always remained a John Doe. And if you're wondering how she knew that, well, one of the officers who comforted my grandma that afternoon was my eventual papa. Hence why she never wanted to admit to him that she knew the potential culprit, since it gave her crippling guilt. She erased all traces of Davy. Not that there was much, because he forced them to live a very minimalistic lifestyle. It wasn't right after, but she slowly started to develop feelings for my papa, and eventually they started seeing each other. A few weeks after the incident, she came to peace with the fact that Davy was never coming back. And for a long time, she always wondered what happened to him. She wanted closure. Was he dead? Did he move out of the country? Or did he just want to separate from my grandma? When I asked for his last name so I could try and find him for her, she just smiled and said that she had given up wanting to know what happened years ago, and she knew that she made the right choice ending up with my papa. She said once my aunt was born, she was terrified that Davy would find her one day. And for a long time, she said that she lived in constant fear that Davy was watching her and that when she least expected it, he would strike. Now that she's passed away, I'll never know Davy's real name or where he ended up, and that's probably for the best. It's wild to me to know that my grandma was married to a criminal, even if it was an unofficial marriage. She dug out an old box from storage and showed me her wedding ring and picture of Davy back then, and it was surreal. Watching her stare at that picture, I could see the fear and love in her eyes. My poor grandma. The fear that she must have felt on a daily basis for a long time, it truly must have been a nightmare. I'm so thankful I took the time to teach my grandma how to use a cell phone. A few months ago, my grandparents were in a situation, and if they didn't know how to work a phone, there was a chance that they wouldn't be here anymore today. I asked my grandma to tell me the story again so I could write it down and share it with y'all. And please let this story be a reminder to everyone that some people are just monsters and enjoy being evil. My grandparents live in the middle of nowhere. My hometown is small and we don't have a bumping nightlife like a lot of the cities. Within my small hometown, which is already desolate, my grandparents live even further into nothingness. If they come over to see my family or my parents' house, it takes them about an hour or so. But even in their 80s, they love to get out and see all their loved ones. My brother was celebrating the birth of his first child, and we had a small get-together at my parents' house. My husband, me, and my grandparents ended up staying for a while playing the card game Pitch. We didn't leave my parents until about after midnight, which would mean my grandparents wouldn't get home until around 1 in the morning. I hated that, so I insisted on them staying at my parents' or even my house, but they insisted on driving home. So my grandparents left and made the hour-ish drive back to their home. While driving, my grandpa ran over something in the road and was forced to pull over. They didn't have a spare tire in the car, so he couldn't change the flat tire. They thought about what to do and decided to just wait there until morning. Knowing the town is small and gets very little traffic, they thought that they would be alone on the road until sunrise. They didn't want to call anybody in the family and wake them up. And I understand the logic, but I would have much rather helped my grandparents out rather than just let them sit on the side of the road for the entire night. About 20 minutes after the flat tire, 2 cars emerged from the darkness. One pulled in behind their car and the other in front of their car. They made sure the doors were locked in the car and they both watched the 2 cars intently. The car behind them started to inch closer to his car until it was practically touching their bumper. Not being super cell phone savvy, she didn't think to call the police right away, and instead, they both just watched, wondering what was happening. Someone then got out of the car behind them and slowly started to make their way to my grandpa's driver's side door. The man didn't say anything and just grabbed my grandpa's door and started to try and open it. While this was happening, someone got out of the passenger side of the car and made their way to my grandma's door. It was another man who just kept telling my grandma to open the door. That person then walked around the driver's side door and started to slam on the window and door. Finally, my grandma came to her senses and pulled out the cell phone that she had just recently learned how to use and dialed the police. The freaks on the outside didn't seem to care and started to smash my grandparents' car with baseball bats. They knew it was only a matter of time before they started to smash the windows in. The man with the bat finally started to demand for their wallets and said that if they didn't get out of the car and give up their money, this would be the end. My grandparents stayed strong and stayed in the car, holding each other's hands and hoping the police would arrive soon. These people jumped on the hood of the car and started to smash the windows and windshield, and the glass started to crack and shatter everywhere. My grandma said that this was the first time that she felt like the end may actually be upon them. But just like a cliche movie, as the glass was starting to shatter inward, lights from a police car could be seen on the horizon. The one man reached into the cracked windshield and actually tried to grab at my grandma's purse, but she pulled back, and the man stumbled and fell off the hood of the car where he was standing. The car in front sped off as soon as he saw the lights. The two men from the car behind my grandparents who were just attacking them ran back to the car after he failed to grab my grandma's purse. They sped off as well, and instead of chasing them, the one cop car stopped and made sure both my grandparents were okay. They gave a description of the men they saw, and the two cars, and the police officers radioed someone and told them what to look out for. It was morning when my grandparents finally called my parents and told them what happened. We all rushed over immediately to make sure that they were okay, and of course, classic grandparents, they were actually laughing and joking. I knew this was hurting them on the inside, but my grandparents always liked to make light of every situation. Maybe that's why they're in their 80s and still going strong. Unfortunately, the two cars and monsters inside the vehicle were never caught, so justice was never served. We'll never know why they targeted my grandparents and where they came from and what their end goal was. Did they just want to rob them, or did they have much worse intentions? These idiots are still out there and potentially preying on the old and weak. Thankfully, my stubborn grandma finally caved in and got a phone and learned how to use it when she did, because who knows what would have happened if she didn't call the police. I'm just happy they're still okay, and at the end of the day, they're still my same old grandparents. This story is a little personal, and I'm not going to use any names or locations just to protect my family's privacy. Every family has dark secrets, or, at the very least, things that they're not proud of. My family has a very dark secret, and I just found out about it at 32 years old. I mean, it makes sense that I was never told about it. Why would any family brag about the story I'm about to tell you right now? So you're probably asking yourself, how did I find out about it now? Well, the simple answer is that my grandma accidentally slipped the information. She's starting to lose her mind a little bit, and it's quite sad and difficult to talk about. The deterioration of her mind is another horrifying story for another day, but due to my grandma's condition, she needs to be watched all the time, and she also just rambles a lot. She says things she doesn't understand, and most of the time we just respond and talk with her. It's weird and sort of sad because sometimes she is as sharp as she can be, and other times it's like talking to a small child. Me and my sister started noticing a lot that my grandma kept mentioning her brother. Just for the record, my grandma has 3 sisters and no brothers, at least to our knowledge. At first, we just thought it was just normal grandma rambling, but she would constantly bring him up, and sometimes she would even get really sad. We asked my mom about it, and since she was the oldest, we figured if grandma had some brother that we didn't know about, she would know. Mom just shrugged it off, saying things like, "Your poor grandmother lost her mind. She's never had any brothers, only had sisters." As time went on, Grandma started becoming more and more upset about her brother. We would try and calm her down the best we could, but it was becoming harder and harder. Finally, we started engaging with Grandma, asking her questions about her brother, and according to her, they were best friends. He would always help my grandma with bullies, but he started to enjoy inflicting pain himself, and he became a bully. My grandma became upset, so we stopped talking to her that afternoon, and we waited a few more days until Grandma brought him up again, and we started to ask questions again, mainly asking the one main question, where is he now? She looked upset and told us a story. For a while, it felt like our old normal grandma again. She seemed sharp and knowledgeable. Her brother got into a bar fight and accidentally seriously injured someone. He spent a few nights in jail and then got released. When he got released, he found the man and we'll just say that he finished the job. He went on the run from the cops. My grandma finally told us her brother's name and our jaws hit the floor. My great uncle has a name that I'm sure you've heard of before. After he left town, he went on a spree, doing some of the most disturbing and heinous things imaginable. It took years, but the police finally caught him and his life ended that day. He never stood trial for his crimes. After everything was said and done, my great-grandparents moved far away and changed their name, trying to erase the memory of the horrible things their son did. My grandma was so affected by the stress and anxiety, and she dropped out of school and spent a long time coming to peace with the fact that her brother was a murderer, and he was now gone. Eventually, she moved on and started her life and never mentioned her brother again until now. That night, we told our mom about it, and she was convinced Grandma was making things up. After all, she watches TV most of the day, and in those situations, it's not impossible to plant an idea into your head. My mom called her sisters and asked if they had ever heard anything like that, and they all said the same thing, which was that they had never heard that story before, ever. My grandma's sisters had all passed away, so there was really nobody else to ask. My mom came over to my grandma's house with us a few days later, and she wanted to talk to Grandma. As soon as she mentioned his name, my grandma's eyes lit up and started to talk about him as a child and how amazing of a mentor he was to her. My mom tried to find out if there was a way that my grandma could prove it without just calling her out for being a liar. My mom asked if she had any pictures from when they were kids, and my grandma paused for a while. It was like the lights were shutting off inside her mind. Her eyes started to well up, and then she said that she didn't have any childhood pictures. She only had one picture to remember him with, and it's under the bed. We ran to the bedroom, and nothing was under the bed except for dust and just boxes of junk. My mom was convinced that Grandma did, in fact, make the entire thing up, and that I admit that I was leaning that way myself until my sister shouted for us to come back into the room. And between the old mattress and box spring was a folder with a newspaper clipping inside. It was an article about her brother and all the horrible things he had done. Behind the article, written on a piece of paper, was a note that said, "I love you, sis. Don't let them beat you up. Love always." And my great-uncle's name. We all looked at each other, and my mom started to cry since she was nearly 60 years old and never knew this about our family. We agreed to tell our entire family so they knew, but we made sure everyone was in agreement not to share the information. I know I slightly broke the promise by writing this, but I needed to get it off my chest. I hope by not sharing names and locations, I'll be able to protect the privacy of myself and my family. As much as the world has changed, it really hasn't. There are good people and horrible people. When my grandpa came over to America from Italy, he endured one of the hardest times of his life. He saved up for years to make the trip a reality, and he wasn't going to stop until he made it to America. The boat ride back then was tough on its own without any help from life or horrible people. My grandfather was a very young man, but he was strong. He was helping on the boat any way that he could to make the trip go by faster. His brother Gino was already in America, and he knew once he arrived that he would have a job lined up. He just needed to get through the long trek across the ocean. At some point during the trip, the boat lost all power and completely stalled in the ocean. Panic ensued on the giant ship, and that alone is enough to haunt your nightmares, but unfortunately, the nightmare was just beginning for my grandpa. My grandfather did his best to try and calm everyone down and keep the people in the highest spirits possible. It didn't take long for some of the folks on the boat to lose their mind and sense of logic. Most of the passengers had dreams of America and starting a new life, but little did they know, those dreams were almost about to be lost at sea forever. A few of the men on the ship decided to commandeer the entire steamship. My grandfather would always compare it to what he would imagine pirates used to do. The rogue men separated everyone on the boat and started to beat people who spoke their minds. He never knew what the endgame was for those men. They never made it clear. Grandpa assumed that it was just some type of power play and that these men were just scared and didn't know what to do. Maybe they didn't want to die at sea as poor men. He wanted to help, but he knew if he spoke up, the men would give him an extra hard beating since he was so large. Because they were at the bottom of the ship, my grandfather had no idea where the captain was during all of this, and he always assumed that he was just hiding somewhere, but he didn't know for sure. The next few hours, my grandfather always said was the worst time of his entire life. Dozens of people all surrounded together in a nearly pitch-black room. He could hear crying and coughing, and most of the people were sure that they were going to die. It was almost impossible to have a high spirit at this point, and he didn't know what was worse, the boat drifting in the middle of the ocean with no direction, or not knowing how much danger they were in with these insane men holding up the ship. To make matters worse, they didn't know how rescue worked, and since nobody knew where the captain was, they didn't know if they had a way to contact a rescue ship or if they were to float until they all starved to death. Finally, my grandpa decided to be a hero, which was a mistake. He got up, tackling one of the men, but 3 others jumped on my grandpa and they decided to beat him up. They found a dark closet of some kind and locked my grandfather in the closet, and for hours, he could hear the most unsettling commotion he had ever heard. He always said horror movies aren't scary. According to him, nothing compares to hearing the real screams of people you know for hours and being trapped and unable to help anyone. And that was what real horror is, according to Grandpa, and I believe him. It always gave me nightmares listening to my grandpa tell the story. It was always the little details that got to me. The near-freezing conditions, the cry of people he knew, and having to deal with this without even a sliver of light is just unimaginable to me. The next few hours were a blur, according to him. He doesn't remember much. He spent a long time trying to break the solid door, but it wouldn't budge. He eventually heard screams he didn't recognize, and he started to pound on the door again. Someone opened the door and freed my grandfather. It was another passenger of the ship, and he explained to my grandfather that a rescue ship had come, and they essentially arrested the men who took over the ship. The screams he had heard last were from the men who took over the ship, and they were screaming as they were being apprehended. I don't know how they did it, but they fixed the ship and they finished the journey to America. He had heard that each of the man that had commandeered the ship stood trial, but he unfortunately didn't know for sure. When they arrived on shore, he told them about the horrible and unfortunate aftermath of the trip. Several people he knew tragically lost their lives, and nothing was done for these poor people and their families. Several of the Italian passengers held a service for those who were lost, but the tragic memory still remains. My grandpa was angry and insulted for years because there was almost no mention of the tragedy. He became disillusioned and his American dream became kind of foggy. He couldn't understand why nothing was being done. He dedicated most of his life to helping with immigration conditions, making arrangements as comfortable as can be and trying to set them up with shelter and a job upon arriving in the country. It's beyond scary to go somewhere new and start over, and my grandfather learned this firsthand. He always said that he endured enough pain, that he doesn't want anyone else to ever have to feel a fraction of what he felt. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursday nights. I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, you're as tasty as a pirate burger.